Hey everybody, welcome to Drive Thru Review 717. Today we're going to talk about a supplement for Stargrave. I don't know if you can get a good view of that. I'll show you a little bit closer in a second. But this is the Dead or Alive Bounty Hunting Solo Scenario Generator. And so what this effectively is kind of the first expansion for Stargrave, which I reviewed a month or two ago. And this is in a way kind of a sneak preview for, let's call it the first official expansion coming out, I think in September of 2021, if you're watching this in real time. And what this is simply a way to play Stargrave in a solo scenario. And it very much lives up to its name of a solo scenario generator. So in all of these different missions and things that you're going to be doing, there's going to be a mark, and that's kind of like your bounty or your target. And you're not always just trying to, eliminate them or capture them. There's some other wrinkles in there too. But there is, I believe, 5 different scenarios. I'll show you the exact count here in a minute. And with like 5 different marks with 4 or 5 different gang configurations that you can go. And you kind of mix and match those different components and then run your crew through a scenario and play it through solo. So let's jump down to the table and I'll give you kind of a walk through some of the rules. It's a pretty small little supplement here. I've got it printed out on PDF. Let's see, it is 20 pages, so it's not very long. So let's jump to the table. I'll show you some of the rules and show you some other stuff, and I'll come back and tell you what I think about it. So before I do a quick little show and tell, I will put links to my original Stargrave review and then also a quick video I did showcasing the different crews that I built. So this is a little bit different than what I've been playing it in. I had set it in kind of a Necromunda-ish Underhive type of world, but this kind of gave me the excuse to throw in kind of an outdoor sci-fi type of area and use some fantasy kind of trees and some other things. And I used some like Warcry temple stuff because there's a thing that takes place in a jungle and there's like an abandoned temple and things like that. So it's kind of a fun excuse to use this supplement and just kind of set up different environments and things like that. And this is the last one that I played. So I played through 3 different of the scenarios and I'll talk about them here. And as promised, here is kind of a close-up of the electronic form. I just wanted to kind of show you the cover in color because I just wanted to give the artists a little bit of props there and give their work a little bit of the attention to detail. But for readability's sake, I'm going to jump over here to the actual printout of the PDF, and so then we can kind of walk through some of the rules and things like that. So again, if you're not familiar with Stargrave rules, look at the links in the description. And so of course these rules won't tell you how to play the game. You will need to have actually the rule book to play, but it will break down some of the differences. And the differences are not major, but they are significant. So the first thing that's going to happen here is the turn structure. So just like a normal game of Frostgrave, you'll start with the captain phase. And there's no initiative. The player, in this case the solo player, is always going to go first, and their captain in any of their group activating figures, if there are any, will go first. And then the entire gang will go second. And then you'll do the first mate phase, soldier phase, and then creature phase. It is worth noting that in the gang phase, all of the models will activate kind of determined by player order. And it doesn't really matter, but the mark, who is a member of the gang and who's the target of you, is always going to activate last in the gang phase. And on the next page here, there's actually an explanation of what I just said. And then here we talk a little bit about the creature actions variant, and this is a variant specific to this supplement. And if you remember from the original Stargrave rules, very similar to Frostgrave, there's kind of a simple flow chart of how random creatures or soldiers or pirates might act once they come on the board. This is going to take over for all of the activations for all of the gang members that you're going to be fighting against, as well as any possible random creatures that come on the board. Now, I do have some caveats with this, but let's just kind of walk through as it's written here. So very simply, if the creature's in combat, then it's going to fight. If it's not in combat, then is the mark in line of sight. So again, the mark is a member of the gang. And so if the creature is a gang member, it will move towards the mark, moving into combat with the mark's opponent if possible. If the creature is not a gang member, so it could be like a randomly spawned creature, then we're going to go to step 3. And then is there a crew member in line of sight? If the creature is armed with a missile weapon, it will then shoot at it. If not, it will take no second action. If the creature has no missile weapon, it will move as far as it can towards the crew member. Now, if none of that's true, we're going to go to step 4. Now, if it's the creature's first action, does it have a missile weapon? Can it bring crew member into line of sight? It'll make the shortest possible move, bring it into line of sight, and then basically shoot at it. And finally, if none of that's true, it will either move to the target point, which I believe for all of the scenarios is just the closest crew member. So it's always going to move to the closest crew member, or if there is no target point for the scenario, then it'll do random movement. And this is kind of the one caveat spot, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the review here. Now, the couple other things to note here. So the game will not just end when the objective has been met. And there will be loot tokens on the game as well. So there'll be usually a couple of loot tokens that you can get in addition to the main objective, which is to take down the mark. But you have to escape with all of the characters. So the enemy gang, the AI gang, will still take shots at you. So you've got to still get them off the table. It won't end immediately. And also after the game, the post game here, there's a different experience table here. So there's some similarities here. So you get 30 points for playing the game, 30 points for if you have a crew member go out of action or 0 health, and then 10 points per power activated and so on. And then here down here at the bottom you can see plus 40 if the mark is reduced to 0 health. And so there will be wrinkles on that. So you're not always just going to reduce the mark to 0 health. Usually that's a part of what you're doing, but you usually have to do something a little bit extra on top of that. And that comes into the scenario generation part of it. And like I said, there's 5 sort of scenarios or settings that will take place here. And so we'll zoom in here. You can see we've got the jungle, the starport, swamp town, abandoned mine, and crystal forest. And I have played through jungle, swamp town, and crystal forest. I didn't do starport or abandoned mine because I've already kind of been playing through some indoorsy kinds of things. So I figured let's do some of these outdoor ones and have some fun with those. So I played for 3 of those with 3 different marks and 3 different gang configurations with 3 different crews. If you watched my video earlier, I made 4 different crews. I basically took the 3 crews that had the lowest sort of total levels, between the captain and the first mate, and left the crew that did the best out of my games that I played earlier a month or so ago, and kind of let them sit on the sidelines and let these other guys kind of go through and basically play a scenario to kind of help them kind of level up and catch up. So this actually could be kind of an interesting tool. I mean, if you're on the honor system, if you're in a league or something, you can say, oh, you know what, Billy, you're kind of on the slack wagon bandwagon right now, and so play a scenario or 2 out of this and try to catch up. Although it's not like a forgive me, so let's get that out of the way. But it could be something that you could do in that kind of situation. So I'm not going to walk through all the rules for each of the different settings here. Again, it's a free download, so you can go check it out, but I will kind of break it down here. So you will usually have one location here. This is NF1, and that's like the main sort of location. And then you'll have an NF2 and an NF3. And what you do, let's just zoom up here super quick on the board, is you will set up, like in this case, this is what I did for this particular scenario, is I set up that tower there, that's NF1. You've got this little tower over here, NF2, NF3, and then there were loot tokens placed next to NF2 and 3 here, and then the mark in this case, which I forget the name of it, but I'll show you, he were set kind of underneath the little bridge there in that little tower over there, and then in this case the players here were starting off in this corner here. And I should say all of the scenarios are played on a 2.5 by 2.5 foot board. That's the way that they're suggested to set that up. And then obviously you want to scatter as much terrain around, have a lot of line of sight blocking, which is a little bit trickier when you're just using trees than solid walls. So anyway, so that's kind of the thing. You just kind of set different sort of key locations up in different spots. And then based on the gang that you generate, you will put sort of a random-ish assortment of troopers, soldiers, commandos, recruits, etc., gunners, grenadiers, burners, and all that stuff in the different next to the different locations, and then randomly pick one of these NF1, 2, 3 locations to put the mark within 2 inches of that as well. And that's kind of the gist of each of these. Is it kind of just a different kind of layout configuration, a different kind of edge or corner where the crew will come in. But then there's also optional rules for like maybe making some of the plants are poisonous, or there's little turrets or something that will shoot. And there's just a kind of a few different things like that you can add. And they're all kind of optional, very kind of narratively flavored, and kind of really up to the player in terms of what they want to do. And I'll talk more about some of those options in a second. So we got the jungle, the starport, swamp town, abandoned mine, and crystal forest. And I told you the 3 that I play, and you can see the options here under there. Now you have the gangs, and then you can either roll in this table. I just actually worked through these, so I played with this gang in the first scenario, second and third scenario. And you can see next to NF1, we'll have a gunner, a trooper, and a recruit, sniper, 2 sentries, burner, pathfinder, and recruit, and so on. they'll even throw guard dogs in here on this particular setup. So you can roll on this table and then apply these to the appropriate locations. And now you have the complications. And so this little mechanic here is going to be like married to the mark. So it's not just take out the mark, reduce them to 0 health. So for example, and again, I played through the first 3 of these. I did physical proof, hostage, and difficult identification. I haven't yet played with these other 2. But physical proof basically sort of turns the mark almost in a way into a loot token. You just have to basically take an action. Once they're down, you take an action to, like, you know, remove their ear or their head or something, you know, and then you bring that back, and then you're able to claim the bounty. Whereas the hostage here, you want to still take down the mark, but then you have another figure that is sort of like behind a building, and then that is like basically a loot token. So you have to take them and then get them off of the board. In addition to, you know, taking down the mark. So if we look here, this is a very interesting scenario. So here's the stats of the hostage. Now nobody will ever directly shoot the hostage, but they can take like splash damage from a grenade or flamethrower. And it says here, if the hostage makes it off the table, the crew may claim an extra 150 credits. If the hostage is killed or not rescued, however, any bounty for the scenario is halved. Because remember, you get 40 points experience for kind of taking out the mark. So if we go to here, we can look at the first mark that I looked at here. This is Christoph on Mars, and they have a displacement field, and they have some special rules and things like that, some special stats, and they have their own little kind of activation table for what they do. But one thing you can see here is they have a bounty. So in addition to getting the 40 experience, I would get 300 credits. That's the bounty on that particular thing. So if you look back at the hostage rules here, then again, you get an extra 150, but if you don't get it, you will have this bounty if you pair this with whatever particular mark. And these will have different things. Like this particular gal here, she kind of just moves around the board, and she'll move from one sort of key location to the next. So from NF1 to NF2 to NF3 and so on, and then off the board. Whereas Tamek's Phage here, she'll just kind of go and camp eventually a loot location, and then she will basically go on to permanent overwatch and take sniper shots basically at people. And then this Doran Soul Shark is kind of like a wizard fella, and they will use, they won't shoot or anything. If they're in combat, they'll fight, but they will actually try to use their spells or their abilities. So they'd have, let's see, what was it? Dark Energy, yep, and what was the other one? Sonic Fire, depending on how close they are. And so they'll just roll off, you know, just on the basic cost of that without any strain or buffs or anything. So the one other thing I did about here, this was the sort of hard to identify one. So once you killed who you thought was the mark, you would then roll a die and see if it was the real mark. I think it was on an 8 or less. It would not be the real mark. And then you would actually move that model, get credit for killing like the next closest crew member. So you might have to do a couple of kills there. Unless, of course, this was the last one. And then you've got a couple more, let's see, Pondo here, and then one more. And I haven't played these two, Colin Prex. That's it there. And so that's it pretty much. You just have, again, the new experience table, the new scenario generations and all that stuff, and just slightly changes to the action order, you know, with crew commander, the gang all activates and so on. And you will still spawn depending on the scenario and on the setting. That's the other thing that these settings do a little bit differently here, is they will have sort of strict-ish rules for how you do spawning of extra creatures. So more likely than not, in addition to the AI team, you're going to be dealing with other either random encounters or pirates that show up, and that's kind of built right into these scenarios here. And they seem to be, from my experience, more frequent than what happens in some of the scenarios for the base game. Okay, so that's a brief overview for the Dead or Alive supplement. I'm not going to go into my normal pillars of review. Again, if you want to watch my original Stargrave review, there'll be a link in the description. But I just want to kind of go through some of the changes and the little quirks here and talk about, you know, what I think of them. So the first thing is the turn structure, right? So the captain phase goes first, and then their entire gang basically gets to activate. And that just kind of really homes in on the fact that keeping your captain alive is super important. Not that it's not important in a regular game of Stargrave, But because, you get to activate, 4 figures, right? The captain and probably 3 other people, and that's going to dwindle as they die. And then the other team, the AI team, gets to activate, 10 figures or whatever it is. And so that's really, you got to really make the most out of that and keep that sucker alive and keep their special abilities alive and all that kind of stuff. Because those little bag of tricks is really what's going to help you get through a lot of these scenarios. So that turns things on its head a little bit, and so you have to kind of just think a little bit differently, because like, oh, once I activate these 3, okay, I'm going to spend my time activating all of these other figures, and then all my soldiers and everything, they ain't going for a while. So you got to be very careful. So you got a little bit judicious about how that works out. Now, the way that the other gang activates and the other creatures activate, I would say this is probably the part I ended up being kind of the loosest with. Because if you go by rules as written in here, all of the creatures activate according to this new sort of priority list that's in the rules. So even if you randomly spawn like a sewer dragon or whatever else, in the jungle, let's say, and they come out, then they're, according to the rules, only going to target a crew member. But I will say, the sort of saving grace of this is there is a line in here. I'll read it for verbatim. Finally, there are times when the player should ignore the rules for creature actions entirely for the mark, the gang, other creatures, and just choose your actions based on what makes sense in a given situation. Because from my perspective, I hit that pretty quickly when I played the jungle one. I was like, okay, I don't remember what it's called. It's like a red drac or something. I use this flesh eater flayer guy. It's like a weird winged demon monster from the jungle. Comes in and it's like, okay, well, you know what? The first thing it actually sees based on where it spawned on the table edge was a member of the AI gang. And I'm like, there's no reason that it wouldn't go eat that thing as opposed to me. So I said, you know what? I'm just going to have that thing treat the other gang like it would in a regular scenario of Stargrave. Because that's what they do. They come in and they just look for the nearest, food basically and try to, munch on it. But depending on the scenario, that doesn't always work. So that's how I played it on a couple of scenarios. The one scenario where I didn't, it was very specific in the scenario that when you spawn stuff, it's basically akin to spawning just another gang member showing up for the opposing gang. And it was basically they show up and 9 times out of 10 it's going to be a ruffian, or it could be a bounty hunter, although there's a rule for not bounty hunter, but I'm going to mess it up. But basically it's a gang member that shows up. So in that case, obviously it's just part of the gang because that's what the rules say, and it made perfect sense. So that you can kind of play with. The other part of it was the target point. And the target point is always the nearest crew member. And I found in some of the scenarios it made sense where they would all sort of like rush in, because depending on how you kind of move around, how the terrain's sort of set up, you could actually like have a bunch of them like jump on like a small group or 1 or 2 of your soldiers, and they're just getting shot at from everywhere. Not to say that that's not necessarily a good tactic and that another player might do that tactic in a game, but they also weren't like, doing any sort of falling back or camping any of the loot tokens or maybe the special objective buildings or whatever it was. They were just kind of completely zerging and attacking. And sometimes I think that makes sense, and sometimes it didn't. So one time when I played the hostage mission, I thought it didn't make sense because the hostage was over here, and theoretically that gang they captured that person for a reason, so they should try to protect them. And in that particular scenario, I was playing my Gene Stealer crew, and the leader, the captain, was a biomorph, and they had this ability where they can burrow. I can't remember, it's like a reconfigure body or something. So I always cast that and then do that, because you can go underground and go through terrain and stuff. I'm like, this is great, I love this ability. So I always tend to default on that, and I found like really quickly within the first turn I was like, oh, so if they all kind of went over here, I put some like bait up this way, they all run over there, and then he'll just kind of scurry up this way, kind of sort of flanking on the outside, staying hidden the whole time, and then just going to get the hostage. So what I did to change that was so dead simple, and I think you can kind of play with this and take it or leave it, was if the agent, or the gang member is going to activate, and if they can move within range of that person, then they will do that, just as like I think the third step is. But they won't always do the target point rule. So if they can get into range then they'll kind of move towards the nearest crew member and try to get a shot out of them. But if not, then I'll do the random movement and basically unplug the target movement temporarily, so that they might kind of sort of move around where that key objective is, where they'll go, oh, okay, in this case, since we have a hostage, I'll move up this way, and then this way, and this way, because I hear gunfire in the distance, but maybe I'm going to go check it out, or then maybe I'll run backwards, and it's kind of random what that character is thinking. And so I had one point where like these two guys were sort of crossing back and forth around the hostage behind the building. I thought, well, that makes sense. They're kind of like on patrol and stuff, and then like one would kind of branch off and then go off, and then he would be kind of, just by the random chance, he would be then about in range. So I was like, okay, now he's close enough, he's going to be able to hear it and move on. So if that makes any sense. So that's the only rule that I had sort of an issue with, was that sort of behavior, because like they're always going to just go after the nearest guy. I was like, I wish they would play more with that. And again, I haven't gone through all these scenarios and setups, so maybe there is that in some of the others. But I think that little wrinkle there you can play around with as it kind of makes sort of thematic sense. Now, other than that sort of wrinkle, I really liked all the different setups, the different spawn rules and everything for everything. Like I said in the walkthrough, it seems to throw a lot more at you in terms of the frequency of the sort of extra creatures and everything. And so again, that's why I kind of fudge that rule, because I'm like, because it is brutal and it is tough, because they will just kind of focus down on you, and they really, it is not an easy win. So I played the 3 times through. The first time, they just completely wiped the entire crew off the board. The second time I played, we got the hostage and almost killed the mark. And so this is another behavioral thing, which I'm not sure if there's a good way around this. So in that particular case, when the mark got to, I believe, less than 7 health, then it'll just beeline it for the side of the board. But the way that you set up the objectives in that particular scenario, they're going to go to the side of the board and just sit there. And so they end up just getting shot at, and then you'd have to do just get a really good lucky big attack off to, drop them down from like 8-9 health all the way off, which is not impossible. I mean, it happens. It's a D20 system. But it was like, okay, they got to 6 health and then they were out. So there was never going to be a chance or anything I could do about that. You had to get that big attack in. So the point of that is that, anyway, that scenario, we got the hostage, but we weren't able to actually kill the mark in that case. But it was almost like I never had a chance to do that, because it moved to the location, and the location was right on the edge of the map. So as soon as you did enough damage, it was just going to zip away, unless you're just able to really double down on it. But knowing that going in again, maybe I would try to save back until we had enough people to shoot at it, like with 4 guys or something. But you could easily miss with all 4 too. Anyway, that kind of stuff you might play around with. It's kind of loosey-goosey. Like 7 feels like maybe it's too many hit points. Maybe it should be 4. Like if it's wounded, then it leaves, and that kind of thing. Now, there's not a lot of time, actually, in my experience, to actually get loot tokens if you know what's good for you, because the clock is really kind of ticking on the other side of it with all the other mechanics going on. So in the second one, I talked about the hostage. We got 1 loot token out there. That was the only loot token I got out of all 3 of the games. In the last game, I could have, but it was like you really were risking having to make some out of action rolls when you didn't really need to. So you could just book out and just forget the loot token. But there was a little bit of a sort of a pusher luck thing there. Yeah. And so some of the optional rules in here, I looked at these and I was like, this is kind of tough already. But maybe if I got better and figured out some of the tactics of some of the, different marks like I talked about, then you might start to add in the optional rules there, and kind of depending on things. So you got to be careful with, I think, stuff that does too much damage to the AI gang, because it is tough. But like I kind of ruled that the creatures would eat them, just because it bothers me that they wouldn't. And so that actually, that was helpful in situations where it's like, oh, cool, a creature spawned behind that dude. He's going to take care of him. I don't have to worry about that. And so if you had like poisonous plants or something, or turrets that also attacked, the gang, the AI gang, that might make it too easy. But you can kind of play around with it and stuff. As a whole, I really like the package and the way it's presented. I love the way the scenario generation stuff worked and that kind of stuff. And so hopefully this is like a good preview of the more official expansion coming out in September, which I think is going to have like kind of the full-fledged solo rules. So I'll be curious to kind of see what changes are, you know, from this scenario generator to that scenario generator, if it's a generator, and that kind of stuff. And generally, though, I really liked how the AI and everything worked, and I could see it where you may have the ability to kind of tweak this to have more than one person play it. Not necessarily cooperatively, but have, you know, kind of a third AI gang in there, and maybe two other gangs that are kind of rivalry, you know, trying to get at the mark, and they're competing for it. And that could be some interesting scenarios there. I don't know how the balance of that would work, but it's certainly, I think it's certainly doable, and it's easy enough to construct that. And you might just, you know, bump up the table size a little bit and then leave it there. And kind of depending on how you spawn and stuff, you might have to tweak that a little bit. But I think it'd be doable, and it should be a lot of fun. Anyway, that's kind of an overview of that. And so if you, if you got Stargrave and haven't had a chance to play with anybody, I would definitely recommend taking a look at this supplement. I think it works really well. And like I said, I was able to kind of seamlessly just kind of plug it into the little sort of mini campaign or whatever I've got going with those crews, and just took the 3 weakest crews and ran them each through. And now they're effectively sort of caught up to the one crew that was doing really well in the campaign. Now you still roll for injuries and stuff like that, so if your captain gets knocked out, you know, you can still lose them. But it's kind of like a free treasure hunting run in a way, because you can get some good amount of credits with the bounty, and you can rack up experience pretty good. And then, but you're still kind of gambling a little bit, you know, with the lives of your crew, so to speak. So it's cool. You can kind of plug and play it. Anyway, that's a good overview of that. Definitely take a look at it. Thanks.